Thanks, everybody. It's a joy to be here tonight. I can act like a journalist again instead of a politician. Bud, this is all off the record for you, okay? I'm not going to... Oh, he's got his... Look, everybody, he's got his camera. If he's rolling, he's going to have a column. Yeah, it's great to see you, Bud. It's great to see everybody here tonight. A lot of familiar faces. And it really does feel good to be back in the presence of journalists and journalism and legends, Mike Cochran, who I can't even tell enough stories that my dad told me about you, and so I'll just cut it off now or it will consume the evening. But it is great to be here. I do miss journalism. I miss Channel 8. I miss walking in the back door of Channel 8 where I walked in every morning, and I first probably walked through that back door when I was 2 years old, as my father, Brett Shipp, was a young reporter at Channel 8 when they built that building, and I just remember always going through that back door and walking down that back hallway, and I miss people coming up to me to, almost on a daily basis saying, "Okay, Shipp, who are you going to piss off today?" And so in keeping with that, I wonder tonight who I'm going to piss off. But I think I'm in a room full of people who can deal with it, because I think we're kindred spirits, and hopefully you're going to appreciate my message. It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom. It was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief. It was the epoch of incredulity. It was the season of light. It was the season of darkness. It was the spring of hope. And it was the winter of despair. That, of course, is Charles Dickens. That, of course, is The Tale of Two Cities. That, of course, was from 1859. That, of course, was London and Paris. But that opening paragraph in that classic novel, I think everybody in here is smart enough to know, aptly applies to what we're seeing in our country today. When I think of the good times, I think of the New York Times. I think of the Washington Post. I think of the Atlantic, the Wall Street Journal, the Guardian, the Hill. I think of the New York Times Magazine and the New Yorker, and what many would probably consider to be a renaissance of great journalism in this country today. Thank you, Donald Trump. President Trump has evoked a renewal and a sense of outrage among Americans and certainly journalists across this country that has inspired great journalists in this country to produce great journalism again. And I think, as we saw last week, the Pulitzer Prize winners in the list of all those who have done such wonderful work in trying to expose and analyze and stay on top of their performance of not only the president but of Congress. I'm hoping that will inspire not only everybody in this room, but especially the young journalists who we will honor here tonight. Many would argue that we have entered a new renaissance of journalism, and that's why we consider it the best of times. But for some, and all of us in this room know, it is the worst of times. And for at least one journalist, Trump has provided the inspiration for a reporter to leave the profession. Yes, it was me. I truly thought, and laugh if you will, I truly thought that the man would not last much more than 6 months in office, and that would be a turning point, and we would, and a reconciliation of moving forward in this country with decency and civility. But that didn't happen, and his outrageous behavior became more and more profound, and I became more and more disgusted. But most importantly, aside from his outrageous behavior, was his attack on the free press, professing that all journalists who cover him and ask him tough questions and don't pander to his political leanings are the enemy of the people was wrong. And that is one of the reasons, and one of the main reasons, that I decided to leave journalism and run for Congress. This incredible assault on our country and the free press was something that we have not seen in some time. If you tell a lie big enough and keep repeating it, people will eventually come to believe it. A quote from Joseph Goebbels. Dale Hansen, if you watch him and appreciate his commentaries, had another great one today. I don't know if you saw it, but it was titled, "If the Free Press Dies, America Will Die." It was on this morning, and I want to quote from it. It was Woodward and Bernstein who brought down a corrupt president, Edward R. Murrow who brought down a corrupt senator and exposed the plight of migrant workers. And it was the television camera that exposed the abuse of black Americans in Mississippi and Alabama and changed America. And if it weren't for Walter Cronkite and his camera crew, we might still be fighting in Vietnam. Thomas Jefferson once said, "Where the press is free and every man able to read, all is safe." But another man once said, "It is the press, above all, which wages a slanderous struggle to tear down everything." Adolf Hitler. This morning as I was going to the gym, I was greeted by a friend, an elderly gentleman who I see every morning at the gym. And he asked me what I was up to, and I told him I had been doing some freelance work this past week for CNN. And he looked at me and he laughed and he said, "CNN, you mean the crappy news network? You can't believe a word they say." And that's what's happening before our very eyes. We're being labeled as the fake news by people who might have something to hide themselves. The free press is not perfect. We're anything but perfect. I have to look at my own father, who wrote a book about imperfections of the business back in the pioneer days of local television news. My dad tells a very famous story of him arriving to a scene of a drowning in the Trinity River back in the day, probably the mid-'60s, a little earlier than that perhaps. And he showed up at the scene, and as he got there, the meat wagon was pulling off, and the body had been recovered from the river. And he just so happened to know the driver of the meat wagon. They didn't have really ambulances or EMS or EMTs back then. It was just you pick a body up and you get them to the hospital or to the morgue. And my dad approached him and he said, "Hey, you got to do me a favor. If I don't have this film, I'm going to be in trouble with my bosses. Can you help me out?" And they knew exactly what he meant. So what did they do? Pulled the body out, dumped it back in the river, got the shot for Brett Shipp. Those were the days. But the best thing about the free press is we journalists tend to police ourselves amazingly well, and making it very difficult for anybody to get away with being fake news. We police ourselves well, especially today in the Me Too era. The Me Too movement has exposed the failings of many what we thought were credible journalists, Charlie Rose and Bill O'Reilly and Matt Lauer, and we found out today Tom Brokaw allegedly was harassing or sexually abusing women. And I also think of how Dan Rather was outed in his quest to do a story on President Bush, and he and his producers did not check all their facts. And that curtailed, if not ruined, his career. But I think the rest of us and most of us, and I'm sure everyone in this room has spent a career doing things and striving to help people and to change people's lives and to make a difference in our world, because that's our calling. That's why we're the Fourth Estate. That's why we exist, to hold people accountable and do so accurately and competently. I mean, I think back on my career, and I think back on the stories that I'm most proud of. I think of the fake drug scandal back in 2000, when we found that innocent civilians, mostly immigrants, were being thrown in jail and deported and imprisoned for wrongly, because a corrupt informant and two corrupt cops were planting fake drugs on them. And we found out that there was a series of these, and that 24 innocent individuals had wrongly been imprisoned, jailed, arrested, and their lives turned upside down. We exposed that. That's the power of the free press. In 2005, I uncovered a collusion between the Texas Workers' Comp Commission and insurance carriers that were denying workers all over the state their benefits and their surgeries and their medicines callously, and ruining their lives. And I exposed it. And when I did that, the Texas legislature had to respond, and they did so by total reformation of the Workers' Comp Commission in this state. And when I found out that people were dying in their homes in 2000, 2007, 2008, explosions, all related to faulty couplings that should have come out of the ground decades ago. Today, we see it still happening. After Atmos Energy and the gas company pledged, raised all of our rates to pay for changes, to make changes, to put in a new system and new infrastructure, they were not doing that. They were pocketing that money, and a little girl lost her life. It's up to we journalists, it is up to the media, the free press, to hold the powerful accountable. One of the stories that I'm most proud of is after the explosion in West Texas, the ammonium nitrate in the storage facility that caught fire and exploded and killed several people. I did an investigation and discovered that in each county across this state, there's supposed to be a committee of citizens and emergency experts who discuss the buildings and the hazardous chemicals that are being housed and stored in buildings around their counties. And that body, that entity is called an LEPC, and that most counties in this state were not forming the LEPCs and not keeping track of dangerous chemicals. And so I filed an open records request with the state to try to find out where dangerous chemicals are being stored. And then the AG at that time, Greg Abbott, ruled that those records are not to be made public, even though federal law dictates that they are public records. And to this day, the state of Texas does not allow individual citizens and groups to find out what chemicals are being stored. I'm fighting the government today, too, as I have endeavored to come back into investigating certain areas that have come to my attention. I have filed several open records requests, and I'm finding it very difficult these days as a private citizen to get access to open records. In the media, when I was with Channel 8, there was a little bit of friction, a little bit of pushback. For the most part, I wouldn't have to pay for open records, for public records. as a private citizen today, an independent journalist, I was sent a bill for some reports today for $260 that are reports that I know should have been made public without a cost, because I know that they were available. But I think now, in this age where individuals and the media can be labeled as fake, and anybody who goes after public records is a threat, then what they have to do is pay more money to get those records. A friend of mine in Houston named Wayne Delcifino has a quasi-journalism business in Houston, and he has, on a daily basis, made open records, Public Information Act requests all over this state. He says it is harder and harder and harder for him to get access to public records, to common public records, because there seems to be a growing attitude of denial. He has even he's had to sue. In fact, he's in a lawsuit now against Texas Tech University trying to get information from them. So why am I coming back to reporting, and why am I willing to fight this fight? Because instantly after I was defeated in my election in the primary in March, people started coming to me saying, Brett, you've got to get back into the media. You've got to get back into reporting. There's no investigative reporters. There's no people asking tough questions. There's no people doing what you did for all those years. There are a few, but there's certainly not enough. To you young journalists, you have to know that there is such a crying need for your services that I feel compelled to get back into doing what I do and digging and unearthing and helping and exposing injustice. I don't have a choice. It's in my blood. It's in my bones. I've got to do it. But as I look around and I see the destruction of the journalistic system in this country, and I see the failings of the newspapers, of the morning news, down to one columnist, Metro columnist. They lost two of their great columnists in the last couple of weeks, Jacqueline Floyd and James Ragland. They're down to Robert Wolanski now. We're losing our journalism. We're losing our free press, and it's happening right in front of our eyes. I'd contacted, in looking for work, I had contacted a friend of mine who is a producer in New York for NBC, and he said, we'd love to have you, but you're going to have to move up here to New York. This is not something that you can do. There's plenty of work. There's a lot of focus on politics. You're a politician or a former politician. It would be great to have your insight and your knowledge, but you're going to have to come to New York. And for those people who work on the East Coast, who work in the Capitol, who work in the political arena, these are the best of times. But for everyone else who's in the city doing regular stories and in the little towns who we count on to keep us informed, to be purveyors of the First Amendment, they're losing their jobs and they're going elsewhere. And we can't allow that to happen. And we can't allow this to be the worst of times. Thank you.